Hey everyone, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be building a simple, minimal web API with F# and Giraffe. So first, we're going to be starting off with an overview of what the web API is and the libraries that we're going to be using to build it. Then we're going to just show you how to actually run this API so you can understand the behavior a little bit better and also play around with the code yourself. And finally, we're going to end with a code walkthrough to go through all of the primary building blocks that allow it to function in the way that it does. So let's start with an overview of the API. So we're going to be building a simple blog backend. Now, this is going to be extremely anemic. There's not going to be a ton of features here, but all it's going to do is have an endpoint for posts, which will return all posts, and that's going to have an endpoint to actually create those posts so we can populate the data model and also kind of show you how we can send payloads to the server and process them. Now again, this is probably not production-ready blog API, but it should give you all the basic building blocks you need to create a more fully fledged API yourself. So we're going to be building on top of the Giraffe micro web framework, which itself is built on ASP.NET, which is basically the .NET ecosystem's official primary Microsoft-supported web framework. Now, there are other web frameworks in F#, a lot of which are pretty good, but for most people, I recommend Giraffe for a few reasons. The first one is that it's really lightweight, so we can kind of think of this as a functional first wrapper around ASP.NET, which is kind of useful because you get all the functionality that you get from the standard .NET ecosystem, but you actually can use all of F#'s nice features with it, which is why we're using F# in the first place. Because it just serves as this kind of functional wrapper around it, we also get really minimal boilerplate, which you'll see when we dive into the code, which makes things like super duper simple, especially if you're just building a very light API. The next thing it has going for it is that it has really good support. Now, good support in the F# community is different than it would be in some other languages just because the community is much, much smaller. But this library itself has pretty good update schedules. Is also pretty popular in the community, which means you have some good support in blog posts or with questions and stuff, and it's quote-unquote endorsed by the F# Foundation, which just gives it a little bit more trust that it should be around for a few years. And lastly, this framework is pretty performant. You can see this in popular benchmarks like Tech and Power or the Web Frameworks benchmark. Most of this is just because it's such a lightweight wrapper on ASP.NET. Basically, any of the upgrades that get pushed to that also kind of flow through to our servers here written in Giraffe. So this is what we'll be building on. If you want to check out the code, look at the documentation and stuff, it's here on the GitHub. And also if you're curious about what other web frameworks F# endorses, I have a link here at the bottom, and all of this will be in the description as well. Okay, so now that we know kind of what kind of API we're going to be building and what we'll be building on top of, let's jump to running the API. So in order to run this API, all you need is .NET SDK. This is going to give us the ability to build and run .NET apps. F# is built on .NET, so that's why we need it. And it will also give us access to the .NET CLI, which is just an easy way to access all of these functions from the command line. So if you don't have that installed, go ahead and install it. Just Google it, really easy, and we'll move forward. So next up is to actually run the API. So I have the full code repo of everything I'm going to be going through today here at this link. That link will also be in the description. So if you go ahead and clone that, and then you just go into the directory, you can simply run .NET run, and it should build and set up the server for you. We will be going through all the code, so you don't necessarily have to do this, but I think it's often useful to look at the code, make some changes, and see kind of how it changes the behavior. So now I'm going to quickly demo actually spinning up this web server, kind of show you how we can interact with it, and then that will give us some good context for the behavior of this API, so I can kind of show you how the code makes this happen. Okay, so I've opened up my VS Code editor into my cloned version of that repo, and now let's go ahead and run the server. So we just have to run .NET run and wait a few seconds, and if everything builds correctly, it should be telling us where this server is running. So the important parts here are that it's going to give us an HTTP endpoint here running on localhost, which tells us the port that it's listening at, and then it'll also give us an HTTPS. For most local dev, I recommend just going the HTTP version. So mine is at 5,000, but on your computer it might be different, so just pay attention to that. So if we click this or go to this in a web browser, we should be able to see this server live. Okay, so I've switched over to my Chrome browser to show you this server and kind of what it returns to us. So I put in localhost 5000 and I'll refresh so you know it's live. And basically I just have a text return here. I'm an API, so we know that it's kind of listening. But now let's check out that first URL, which is the /post URL, and see what it returns to us. So if I refresh this, we see that we're getting nothing back. That makes sense. I started a new server. It doesn't have any default data. And so first we need to actually create posts for it to return posts. So to create posts and send a post request, I'm coming over to Postman for that. We can see that it's going to post to localhost 5000 where the server is listening to /post/create. And I'm going to send it a JSON payload with title and content, which is the payload that this endpoint accepts. So I'm going to create a few of them. So post 1, we can see that it returns this because my API returns the new post that was just created. And let's create a few of them. So let's do post 2, post 3. And now if we switch over to the Chrome browser and then hit this get URL again, we should see all these new posts. So let me refresh. And here we have it, post 1, post 2, and post 3 coming from the web API. So hopefully this context gives you an idea from a high level what this is supposed to do, and also validates that this is actually how the API works. Now we're going to dive into the actual code that allows it to behave in this way. So I'm going to walk through the code in basically 3 steps, which are the 3 main parts of this API. First is the .fsproj. This is basically just project metadata that kind of tells the compiler what dependencies do we need to build this project, how should we build it, what runtime should we target, what kind of output do you want, all sorts of things like that. If you're coming from the JavaScript ecosystem, this is similar to a package.json, and a lot of different languages have something similar. The next part that we'll be talking about is a program.fs. This is basically the main entry point. A lot of times, like in Python or something, it'll be the main function. And what we're going to be doing here is actually setting up the web server and declaring what routes we want to serve externally and what code that actually needs to call into within our domain. Finally, we'll be talking about blog.fs, which is basically all the domain logic that makes this a blog API versus being like a number counter API or something like that. So feel free to skip around. Again, the full source code is available on my site, and you can access to the full repo if you want to follow along there. But let's get into the code. Okay, so we're back in my VS Code editor, and here we can see that we've got this .fsproj project file. We've got the program.fs, which we'll be going into next, and then finally blog.fs. So let's open up the fsproj. So basically, this is just a bunch of declarations about what we actually rely on in order to actually build this. So we're targeting .NET 6. .NET 7 is out, but .NET 6 is the long-term support one, so that's what we're using. We're declaring the files that we actually need in order to build and run this F# project. In F#, you do have to manually say which files you want to compile and the order in which they compile. It's a little annoying, but it does enforce that there's no circular dependencies, so that's kind of good. So here you can see that we have block.fs first, which is our domain logic, and then next we have program.fs, the reason being program.fs requires the domain logic so it can actually call into it. And finally here we've got our dependencies. All we need is Giraffe here. We're using version 6.0, which is the latest version, which does still run on .NET 6. So that's it, just basic metadata about how to build the file and what dependencies we need to actually pull down. So now let's go over to program.fs. So this is the main entry point, and there is a bit of boilerplate here, but I've tried to break it into sections so it's kind of easy to follow along. So here we're just opening a bunch of libraries that we will want to use. Most of this is just boilerplate for ASP.NET, but here's the important parts here. For our domain, here's where we're getting all of the access to our blog domain, and here's where we're actually opening Giraffe so we can access it and plug it into ASP.NET. So the first real section where we're actually doing code, not just importing stuff, is this section where we're doing web app configuration. Now this is just a function that returns some configuration, which we'll use in boilerplate a bit later. But this is basically the logic to connect all of the routes from our external API into the code that we've actually written to create our blog functionality. So let's go through this. Basically, this is the router for Giraffe, and you can see that its basic setup is that there's going to be a route function that declares what route we want to be declaring logic for, and then it's going to have this, which you can kind of think of just as if this, go to this. And then it ends with some sort of pattern like type of return type and then thing to return. This is overly simplified, but we'll talk about the kind of harder parts a little later. So here we're saying if you hit the slash, so localhost 5000 slash, like we did, we just want to return text, which is I am an API, which we saw in the demo. So that's a basic route. The next thing we have here is subroute, which basically says anything within the subroute, we want you to use this prefix. And so here we've got /post, so everything down here is going to be /posts and then plus whatever other route we declare. And so here's where we're doing the /post get. So we're saying if you are at /post, if you are a get request, then we basically want to funnel you into the get post HTTP handler, which I've defined and we'll talk about in a second, and return that return type. Now there's two things that probably look a little weird here. The first is this warbler. What is that? Well, basically F# Giraffe, once you spin up the server, it will try to eagerly evaluate all of these functions, which can be really fast if you're returning things that never change, like a static file or something. But if you have endpoints that every time you hit it, you'll need to do some dynamic requests that might return something different, like we do here, then you'll need to use warbler so that it knows that it should reevaluate whatever function this is. So that's the first weird thing. The second thing that you might find weird is that I'm passing in service tree. Basically, this is just a very simple version of dependency injection that I've created. The reason being we have some shared state here, which we'll talk about later, but it's basically a blog DB, just a list of blog posts. I pass in a service tree so that we can basically easily create this at the start of the web server, and then we can also pass this around to any kind of function that needs this. This is just a function that will grab the new blog DB that we've created. Again, this is a little bit out of scope for this video, but basically it's just a way to actually grab access to that shared state. Okay, so that's the get posts endpoint, and now let's talk about how we're actually creating. So again, we just have this /create. So again, this will be /post/create. We're checking that this is actually a post request because we only want posts to actually create something. We have a warbler because this is, dynamic. And then again, we're passing this off to the create post HTTP handler, and we're passing in the service tree so it has access to that shared state, which is our blog DB. And that's basically it. So this is how you actually declare these routes and say what kind of code it goes into. You'll notice that we don't have a text version here, and that's because these are actually handled within the handler, which we'll show you in a bit. But before we do that, let's jump down to the next section, which is infrastructure configuration. Now, if you've built .NET before, this should be pretty familiar to you. Basically, this is the boilerplate to set up ASP.NET and configure it for how to run. There's so many ways to configure this, which is way just outside the scope of this video. But basically, if you're just creating a simple Giraffe API, you can just think of this as boilerplate and copy and paste it into your projects. The important things are that here we're configuring app for this configure stage, and we're telling it to use Giraffe. And then again, we're configuring services, and we're saying that we want it to add Giraffe. You'll notice here that this is where we're actually passing in web app, which is where we're actually giving it all of the routes we want it to use and all of the connections to the logic we want it to call. But again, if you're just building something, you could probably just copy and paste this and it'll be good for a while. Okay, so that's the program.fs. This is how we're starting up the web server. This is how we're connecting it to the code that we've written for the blog functionality. Now let's jump into blog.fs and see what actually makes this a blog API. So we're going to be just going from top to bottom. F# compiles top to bottom, so this makes sense. Starting at the top, we just got our imports here. Now we get into code that I've actually written. So this is where I'm actually saying what a blog post is. From the post request I demoed earlier, this should be familiar, where it's just a title, which is a string, and content, which is a string in JSON format. This is doing double duty. It's both our domain model and also our DTO from the request, which is maybe bad, but it keeps things simple. And I'll talk about CLI mutable in a second, but basically this is what allows the framework to treat this as a DTO and to dynamically create this model from our request payload. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. So we have blog post defined, and then we see this blog DB that we created at the root of our web server. This is basically just a mutable class, which allows us to have a simple way to hold and share all the blog posts that we've created, all the state that we need. This is a great example of F# being a functional first language, but you can always revert back to OO if that is useful, which it is in this case. So if we look at it, basically it's just a mutable list here of blog posts. It has two functions on it, which are members. One function that just returns all blog posts to the current state of the list, and another function that allows you to pass in a blog post, and it's just going to prepend that to the list, and then it will return the full list back. Next, we're defining the service tree, which again is just all the dependencies that these requests require. All they need is a way to get this blog DB so that it can have access to the shared state, so it can get the current blog posts, and it can also append to it in the case of the create request. Now, with all those defined, we can finally get to the HTTP handlers. Now, HTTP handler is a term used by Giraffe. It's basically the basic building blocks to link the request pipeline into your logic. Now, a full deep dive into this is out of the scope of this video, but we do have to touch on it because it does look a little weird, and this is kind of the main building block of Giraffe. And so basically all of my handlers look like this. So it's the name of the handler, and then I'm passing in the service tree, so all the dependencies that these things need to actually function. And then what it's going to return is a function of HTTP func to HTTP context. Now this is what basically the definition of an HTTP handler, and all it's saying basically is this is the thing that Giraffe needs in order to continue the request pipeline. And so by doing this, when I pass back a handler like this, I have a closure over this service tree so that anything that I call next has access to this, which gives us access to that shared state. And then because we pass back this function here, Giraffe has an easy way to just continue down this request pipeline to actually make this code work. This is a little bit complicated, especially if you're not used to functional programming, if you're not used to their kind of request pipelines in .NET. But if you just kind of treat this as boilerplate, where you pass in a service tree here, and you just return this functions like this, the HTTP handler definition, then you should be able to skip a lot of this complexity for now. So if we look at what this is actually doing, we're passing in that service tree, we're returning this thing so that Giraffe can call it later. And then what we're doing is using the service tree to get that shared blog DB, and then we're just calling get all posts on it. So this is how we're getting whatever the latest state is for that. And then the interesting part here is that we're returning this as JSON, and we're passing in the next context here, which is how we basically continue down the chain of the request pipeline. So if we look at the create post HTTP handler, we can see that it's basically the same thing. We're doing some async stuff, so we wrap it in this task. And here's where we're actually getting the post payload in that blog post format. Now, because we're using it this way, this is why we needed the CLI mutable up top. This basically allows these records to be created, kind of breaking some of the strict rules around immutability. And we're basically saying there can be a default getter, a default setter for these things, which basically makes it mutable. But this is how a lot of functions like this, where you're trying to dynamically create an object, work. Dapper is kind of similar as well. So this is how we're accessing the post. We're using HTTP context here. We are saying we want to bind to the JSON, and we're saying we want it to be of the format blog post. And because that's CLI mutable, theoretically this works. So assuming that the payload was well formed, theoretically we'll get this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to, again, access the shared state, that blog DB that we passed in the service tree. And then we're just going to say we want to add this new post that we got from the payload. Finally, we're going to, again, return this as JSON, just the new post that we got, and next context so that we can continue down the request chain. Now, if you're new to F#, these things are basically saying that, hey, we're in async and we want to await. There is no async await terminology in the same sense that it is in like C# or maybe even JavaScript, but these are basically how we say we want you to await this. And that's it. That was a lot of code, a lot of me talking. So I would really encourage you to go check out the full source code and kind of walk through it line by line. The whole idea here was to give you a lot of descriptions here so you can check back if you don't understand something, but often it's best to just see it yourself. So links will be here and in the description. And again, it's just these 3 parts. We went through a lot of code, but really just 3 files. So hopefully it's a little bit manageable. Now this is a very simple minimal API to just kind of give you an idea of the building blocks and how they go together for an API. But if you're looking to see how this kind of scales up to production grade, how we do dependency injection, how we do configuration and everything like that, we do use Giraffe and CloudSeed, which is an F# and SvelteKit boilerplate. So if you're interested in that, check out this video, which kind of shows you how it's built and how to get started with it. So as always, let me know if you have any questions about this, anything that could be improved, anything that is confusing about F#, Giraffe, .NET, etc. This helps me figure out what I'm going to talk about next. And here's where you can find me online. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.